Thanks for listening and thanks for subscribing to Learning More. Today, we are talking with Todd Fisher. We're going to be talking about his mom, Debbie Reynolds, and his sister, Carrie Fisher. We learn more about these two great actresses today on Learning More. Today, we discuss Mary Frances Reynolds. She was born in El Paso, Texas on April 1st, 1932. When she turned 6, her family moved to Southern California. By the time she was 16, she had a movie contract with Warner Brothers and a name change. She became Debbie Reynolds. She then moved to MGM, and she was in this film called 2 Weeks with Love. She sang a song, and it sold more than 1 million copies. The next big hit for her was Singin' in the Rain, where she danced alongside Fred Astaire. In 1955, she met Eddie Fisher, and just a few weeks after they met, they were engaged. Now, there's a little bit of a twist to that story that we'll hear later. In September of 1955, they were married. A year later, they had their daughter, Carrie Fisher. We all know her and love her as Princess Leia in Star Wars. Another year goes by for Debbie and Eddie, and their second child is born, Todd Fisher. Todd joins us today. Hello, Todd.
The last of the Mohicans. I'm still here.
Yes, you are.
That was one of my mom's favorite opening songs. I'm still here.
Ah, yes. I remember that song. It's coming back.
That's right. And she would do it because she had survived so many things in her life that I think people enjoyed seeing her survive. You know, she was like one of these people that had this. Well, first of all, she was a real regular person, as you just outlined in your lineage there, that, you know, she had come from Texas and, you know, didn't want to even be in show business. And so this sort of, she was really just one of the people. She was a movie star fan. She went to the movies and paid a dime. And, you know, she had her favorite stars. She never dreamed that she was going to be one day.
Right. Well, actually, let's talk about that move. Why did they move from El Paso, Texas to, Burbank?
So my grandfather, this is the middle of the Depression. My grandfather works for the Southern Pacific Railroad, and they give him an opportunity to take a job for them in Burbank, California. Now, at the time, Burbank is, I won't use the word, you know, it's just the armpit of nowhere. But it was a bit of a risk to come. But California was always a desirable place. You know, California is the place you ought to be.
Right.
So they moved up the truck and they moved to Burbank. Now, and literally like the Beverly Hillbillies, they moved in a Model T Ford and and everything was hanging off the truck and they were going 20 miles an hour across the desert. Very much like the Grapes of Wrath. You know, I mean, it was the Steinbeck classic, except the Reynolds family was hauling itself across there. And my great-grandmother was in the truck from the Harmon side of our family. And they all came to California. And my mother started going to school in Burbank, California, and literally finished high school there. And that's how she eventually wins in this Burbank contest.
Let's start with your mom's passion and her drive. Where do you think that came from?
Well, I know where it came from because I was programmed by the same person. You know, I didn't go to a Tony Robbins convention. We were both programmed by my grandfather individually. This is Ray Reynolds. And, you know, he taught me as a little boy something that I didn't realize he had also taught my mother. I didn't know this for 25 years. But when I was a little boy, we were painting a fence. He was painting a fence in his backyard, a white picket fence like Tom Sawyer. And I walked up to him, about 7 years old, and I said, "Hey, can I get in on that action?" And he said, "Yeah, sure. But if you're going to start painting this fence with me, you have to finish it with me." And I was like, "Hey, man, no problem whatsoever. Let's roll with this." So he gives me the brush. We start painting. An hour later, I walk back over to him and I kind of hand him back the brush. And I said, I've had enough. And he says, "What?" I said, "Well, I can't do anymore." He says, "You what?" I said, "I can't do anymore." He says, "There is no word in this family's vocabulary, can't. That's not in our vocabulary." He's talking to a 7-year-old.
Right.
He's down on his knees, so he's eye to eye with me. He was very intense. And I was like, okay. And believe me, he was a little intimidating. He was a very sweet man, but he was the patriarch of the family, and he was like very intense. And you're like, you bought into it. So I didn't realize that he had done that to my mother many, many years prior. And that is what led up to my mother being able to withstand Gene Kelly trying to kind of get her to quit. I mean, in the middle of early days of Singin' in the Rain, he didn't want my mother at all. And he was, really trying to prove his point that she wasn't up to it. And her feet were bleeding, and she's under this little piano on a soundstage, and this person leans down and she's crying under the table, and he leans down and says, "What's going on down there?" And she looks up, and it's Fred Astaire. And
Oh, wow.
he reaches out his hand to her and he says, "Come with me." And he takes her down the road, down the MGM streets to a private soundstage where he rehearsed with Pandro Bergman and rehearsed and choreographed all of his great numbers. And he sat her down and she watched him
Mm-hmm.
work really hard and beat himself to death. That no one knew that it took weeks of countless hours to make those numbers perfect. No one knew. She didn't know. And then she
Right.
thought, wow, if it's good enough, if that's how hard it is for Fred Astaire, I guess I understand why it's hard for me. But also echoing in the back of her mind is there's no word can't in our
Right.
vocabulary.
Right.
So those two factors between Ray Reynolds and Fred Astaire, that's pretty wide apart there. That is what gave my mother her drive in life in many ways. Now, she also had tremendous faith. She was a Christian and a person of faith, and so she knew she wasn't alone in the world, and so her faith was important to her as well. But these are very tangible, actionable things that she lived by.
And she was just 19 during Singing in the Rain,
That's
right?
right. That is
Oh,
exactly
wow.
right. Yeah, it's an easy time to say I've had
Wow.
enough, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think of the amount of things that I quit when I was 19, just from a little struggle. And she just went on, powered through. And she was even in her bed for a couple of days after one of those scenes because it was so tough, right?
It's not that she couldn't handle the work. I mean, at 19, we were all pretty tough, and she was no exception. She was a tough girl anyway. She was a tomboy. She had her uncles and her brother. She grew up with them. She was one girl amongst many boys, and so she was a very, very quite capable to stand up to anybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You ask yourself in this world, we hear a lot about, the Harvey Weinsteins of the world and people like that. And like, you can imagine that people tried to pull that with my mom,
Right.
but
Right.
you can
Right.
also imagine that she bit back.
Oh, yeah. I would imagine that Carrie would bite back as well.
Yeah. So Carrie actually had a direct story with Harvey Weinstein where, he had inappropriately uh, talked to her or tried to touch her in some inappropriate way. I can't say what she said precisely, but she told him to take his little, what, and head to the other room. So she really slammed the
Jeez.
guy. And this also happened to a friend of hers, and she found out about it. And so she sent Harvey a dead fish in the mail, like a Sicilian message, a large sea bass.
Wow.
But the truth is, both my mother and Carrie were also just tough broads. They're quite capable of standing up for themselves. Not
Right.
everybody is, but they certainly were. And my mother was, infamous for being able to handle herself. I mean, so, and of course, Carrie, in my opinion, was kind of a level beyond that. She had a lightsaber to boot, so.
Right, exactly. Hey, one of the things that I've often heard, Carrie would have said something about her childhood, maybe not having a happy childhood. Now, you say that you had a happy childhood. What's the story there?
Well, I mean, the problem with Carrie's story, my mother used to joke about it all the time, but it's true. She was like, Carrie would say, "I didn't have a happy childhood," and my mother would say, "Yes, you did. I have films." And she had we have hundreds of hours of home movies, where Carrie is just raucousing around with me. And we have elephants in the backyard and these huge parties, and all the
Right.
celebrities are there and all of our friends are there with elaborate cakes, and we've rented out theme parks. I mean, it's surreal. So the
Right.
idea that you had an unhappy childhood when you look at the world we grew up in is incredibly absurd. And I used to say to Carrie, you could get away with it maybe if she didn't have the movies and I wasn't here. But the fact is, I
Right.
was there every minute
You
of
saw
every
it.
I lived it. So,
Yeah, exactly.
by the way, she didn't know about this unhappy childhood until she went into therapy, and some therapists tried to point out that all of your problems are from your parents and Freudian other issues, and there were as therapy evolved over the decades. We stopped blaming our parents and took some personal responsibility, and maybe our
Mhm.
childhood was actually not that bad after all.
You mentioned the parties, and okay, so your mom, Hollywood legend, right? And you're growing up around her. She's just mom, so it's normal for you. But I'm assuming, but as a kid, you're next to all these other legends. I mean, you probably had Frank Sinatra hanging out of your house.
We had everybody. I mean, at one time or another, and so we, and that was our version of normal, right?
Right,
It's not as
right.
though that wasn't that was normal. But on the other hand, like in hindsight, or at different times, you could look back at one of these parties and go, "Wow, I just met Charlie Chaplin and Norman Rockwell and
Right.
Betty Davis. I can remember
Oh my
like Edward
God.
G. Robinson dancing with my mother at a party, and Jimmy Stewart and Gary Cooper. I mean, it's like everybody
Mhm.
you could think of was at our
Yeah.
house at one time or another. So that's a little surreal, but it was our version of normal. I mean, I like one of the great people that used to come to our parties was James Garner. And what I remember about that is that he didn't like the parties that much. So he'd come in my room and play slot cars with me and my friends. So,
That's awesome.
and in my book, I write about Betty Davis being in my bathroom and me walking in on her in my bathroom and her having a full conversation with me while she's sitting on the john. Now that's pretty freaking surreal.
That is.
And
Oh wow.
now that one I even remember being intimidated by, and it took a lot to intimidate me.
It seems like in some of the documentaries and whatnot that I've watched about your mom, she wanted to be a mom. I mean, she had this job, but she wanted to be a mom. She brought you guys on the set and, hung out with you there. And, she was just trying to be just,
Well,
I guess, like
in the end, that's
an old
she was.
school Texas mom.
Well, that's true. And in the end, she was asked a question: "What was the thing you were most proud of?" And it was her children and her
Hmm.
raising us the way that she did. She did such an amazing job of keeping that balance. But you're right, she took us everywhere. But it wasn't like the nanny thing, although we had nannies around at times. But I mean, she was hands on. And, she didn't bypass the responsibility and leave us home. We traveled the world with her, and we're on sets all over the world and all over the country, and hung out at the studio with her, and she was a hands-on mother, and it was very unusual because I had a lot of other friends in similar situations, and their mother, sort of, let the nanny handle things, and they
Right.
stayed home a lot. So I knew I was privileged in that regard.
Oh, yeah. Or you read about
Yeah,
everybody
you know
that's
the stories.
not
I don't
raising
need
the
to name
kids.
the
Yeah.
names, but I mean,
Oh,
there
yeah.
were a lot
Yeah.
of kids that you haven't read books about, that got screwed up, because
Yeah.
they didn't really have any parents. They were raised
Right.
by the housekeepers. I mean, that's just not happening. My mother was very hands-on, very conscientious. She was very fixated on making sure we weren't spoiled. Now, that's not to say we didn't have everything. We had a ton of stuff, but she made a distinction about being spoiled. She said, I know a lot of people that have very little that are spoiled. She says the difference is if you appreciate what you have, then you're not spoiled. But
Mm.
when you don't appreciate what you have, now you're spoiled. And it's
Yeah.
an interesting thing to teach children. Those are the life
Yeah.
lessons that, we grew up around. I mean, you got to remember, my mother was grooming Carrie as a little Beverly Hills princess long before George Lucas ever had the idea that he was looking for a Princess Leia. And so for my whole life, my mother's grooming Carrie a certain way, and everything you know about Carrie is part of the way my mother groomed her and raised her. By the time she walks into this little audition room and George Lucas is there and has her read the script, and she says, "I'd recognize your foul stench anywhere." And she's got that attitude in Darth Vader's face, and immediately George Lucas is like, "There it is.
Right.
There's the princess." What he didn't
Yeah.
know is that, that had been going on and had been worked on and groomed by my mother, for a decade.
Yeah. And she was just 19 when she got that role, right?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? My mother
Yeah. Both of them at
was
19 with their big roles.
well, it's not just the big roles. Here's an interesting little mirrored effect. The greatest musical arguably ever made is Singing in the Rain. My mother stars in that at 19. The greatest science fiction film ever made is the original Star Wars film, and
Right.
Carrie stars at that at 19. That's an interesting little
Oh, yeah.
mirroring there.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to think, if anybody is going to think a musical, they're going to think Singing in the Rain. If anybody's going to think science fiction, it's that, Star Wars.
That's right.
So, yeah,
I mean,
that's
it's
pretty
not to say
amazing.
there's not other great films. It's just to say that those are pretty influential, and
Oh,
certainly
totally.
could be argued that they're the best in their respective areas.
Oh yeah, definitely. I don't even think it's worth an argument. I think it's truth.
Well,
For
I
sure.
like it depends who you're talking to. There's a lot
Yeah.
of film historians. I'm sure you could bring up some great other film, and I'm a bit of a film buff myself, but and I know the things that influenced George, and so you could say 2001. Carrie was being interviewed in London one time, uh, back when we were working on the first Star Wars film, and they asked her. They said, "What's your favorite science fiction film?" And literally, she froze, and you could see her look over the guy's shoulder to me, and I'm mouthing the words 2001 because it's the only science fiction film that she and we weren't big science fiction fans, right? So it
Right.
wasn't like she just froze. She couldn't think of anything at the moment.
Right.
She could have said War of the Worlds. You could have said Fantastic Planet. You could have said a lot of stuff, but she just literally just froze. Oh, you heard the sound, the blaster sound in the background. That's Archie.
Yeah,
Our
that's Carrie's parrot in the
that's right.
background, right?
That's right. So Archie's been with me for about 30 years, but he belonged to Carrie for about a decade, and then was given to me about 20 years ago. But so he was brought up on laser blaster sounds. So occasionally, if you hear that sound in the background, you know it's not me watching a movie. It's just the bird.
That's funny. Does the parrot talk?
Oh yes. In fact, he even talks in Carrie's voice. He says,
Oh, really?
"Hello, dear." See,
Oh, that's
Carrie
cool.
used to do there he goes. Carrie used to do a mocking of my mother. My mother used to call us up on the phone, and she'd say, "Hello, dear. This is your mother." And we'd be like, "Yeah, like we don't know." But she kind of talked like that sometimes. She was being formal. "Hello, dear. Dear, Lillian and I would love to come over. It was like an old Hollywood dialect. And Carrie and I used to make fun of her when she would do that. So the inside joke that she teaches the bird is "Hello, dear." So, but it knows a lot of other words,
That's funny.
and he
That's
does it
funny.
perfectly in her voice, which can be a little eerie at times.
That's so cool. It's a piece of Carrie and a piece of your mom, kind of all rolled into one bird. Man, the stories that bird can tell, huh?
Yeah, well, our whole life is about storytelling. My mother was a master storyteller and handed that down to Carrie and I, and of course, Carrie wrote tons of stories as well. And but we all love storytelling. I just think that is what this business is all about. I'm not
Hmm.
interested in rehashing, you know, Spider-Man 12. I mean, I think it's fine for those people that love that type of thing, but I just think there's millions of great stories that have been untold, you
Yeah,
know,
right,
that
right.
that don't get told because we're all fixated on the next Batman series, but
Yeah,
but it's a shame because we live in a world with every day unfolding more and more inspirational great stories. And so to me, my mother and sister's story was very inspirational, and that is why I wrote the book My Girls, about them and how they moved through life and accomplished a lot of the things that they accomplished. And I had kind of a front row seat to that show.
right. Well, and also in Bright Lights, the documentary, the
Yes. Well,
that
so I,
that
I was one of the producers on that film, and that was actually Carrie's idea. She was concerned that my mother was getting old, and frail, and wasn't sure how much longer we were going to have her. And so she was like, "Let's do like a legacy piece on my mom." And I said, "Oh, that's never going to go over. She's never going to want to do that."
Mhm.
So you got to come up with a better angle to get her to do it. So the angle became more of the story about the family and her and Carrie, and she bought off on that notion that it could be.
Right,
But
right.
really, we were sneaking around the idea of doing a legacy piece on her. But my mother was very conscientious about not wanting to blow her own horn ever.
Mm.
It was always. In fact, it used to annoy me at times when we were doing the museum. Here in Vegas, we had the Hollywood Museum, and I put out a bunch of Debbie costumes with hundreds of other costumes. And my mother showed up at one point and said, "Oh, there's too many Debbie costumes." I said, "So what do you want me to get rid of? Singing in the Rain?" I have two Singing in the Rain costumes. Should I get rid of Good Morning as opposed to, I mean, what
Right.
exactly? I mean, what are we talking about here? If it was anybody other star and her name wasn't there, she'd be fine with it.
Right.
But she was conscientious. There was too many Debbie costumes. By the way, I took them down for like 2 weeks and then I put them back up again.
Oh,
So
okay.
because I knew the people would want to see
Yeah.
it.
Oh, yeah,
It's
totally.
like,
Well, if you're gonna go, yeah, you gotta see that.
well, and it's her collection. It's not
Right.
about her. but it is indirectly, and people want to see her as much as they do all these other people. But she never saw herself as important as a lot of these other stars. I think it would have been rather interesting and gratifying for her when she did get to watch what happened when she passed. I mean, the outpouring from her fans was
Mm,
unbelievable. And it was Carrie's fans and her fans. It was just unbelievable. The connection that she had with her fans
right.
became very apparent. And all of a sudden, nobody could deny her importance, and
Right.
not even her. Now, she wasn't here to complain about it. But I was gratified at any rate.
All right. I have got so many more topics to talk to you about. So we're going to take a short break here. But when we come back, I want to find out about your parents' meeting. I want to find out a little bit more about Carrie and your final moments with your mom and with Carrie. We'll talk about that when we come back. Thanks for listening and thank you for subscribing to Learning More. I'm Russ. And today I am joined by Todd Fisher. We've been talking about his mom, Debbie Reynolds, his sister, Carrie Fisher, and we all know what happened in 2016. Just after Christmas, Carrie Fisher passed away. The very next day, Debbie Reynolds passed away. Now, a lot of people say that Debbie died of a broken heart, but Todd, you justifiably, I feel, disagree with that. You were there. What happened?
Well, I mean, first of all, I didn't. It's not like I wanted to contradict that point of view, but it's just not true or nor accurate. It was a bunch of these, PhD pundits on the news shows trying to explain, what had happened to Debbie when they have absolutely no information whatsoever about the reality of what happened. But I was right there. I mean, I was literally with her for her last words. And the
Hmm.
last words were, "I need to be with Carrie." Now, I didn't know what she was talking about at that moment. You just think they're words. I didn't realize she literally meant she was going to go be with Carrie. But there was no heartbreak or tears. It was literally a intentional departure. Philosophically, she knew. First of all, in my book, I write about me being brought into this world. My mother chased my father down. She knew the marriage wasn't going along that well, but she didn't want Carrie to be an only child. She didn't want her to be alone.
Hmm.
She literally ran my father down in Europe and gave him a couple of beers, and she got pregnant. She was with her best friend, and she went back to the room after sleeping with him one time, and she said to her best friend, "Okay, we can go home now." And the girl was like, "Debbie, that's not how it works. I mean, you don't, you know." She goes, "No, I know I'm pregnant. We can go home." And she's like, that can't be. We're going home.
Hmm.
She goes home, and here I am talking to you right now. So obviously, she had a pretty good sense of this. But what it was all about was she wanted Carrie to have a companion. I was the companion. Now, when I couldn't follow Carrie, she had just left the earth. My mother knew that, but she in her mind could and did. And so
Wow.
there's a certain amount of sadness and grief that hits you about that. But when I realized what had happened and she had willed herself off the earth to be with Carrie, it became more magical, as
Yeah.
opposed to something sad. And,
Right.
and and that I had to share because I knew that Debbie's fans would want to understand what had happened and
Right.
why. It
Right.
wasn't about, "Oh, I'm so sad I died of grief." It
Yeah.
just didn't happen. I was with her from front to back. I didn't leave her for a 24-hour period there after the hospital with Carrie.
Hmm.
It was not about that. So
Yeah.
it's kind of magical and beautiful.
Yeah, it is. I mean, to hear that, because it was so depressing to hear this news. I mean, I'm telling you this, but I mean, it's like
Sure.
for everybody, everybody that was a fan of either one of them, just it was sadness everywhere, and it's an uplifting story in an odd way.
Well, I think people were shocked that it could even be. Like, it's
Yeah,
surreal. And you're like, what? How could this be?
yeah,
It doesn't make any sense. I mean, the fact that Carrie died the way she died was already sort of inexplicable, and the timing of that is
yeah,
odd. I made a comment recently where I said, the truth is we were lucky to have Carrie that long, given her propensity for mental illness and her drug issues. and she lived she lived in the fast lane. That's all there is to it. And so that we had her all those years was miraculous. And my mother, at the end, when she was in a coma, my mother, prior to her actually passing, said, "We just Can we just have a little more time?" Like in an outwardly spoken prayer. She just wanted a little more time. She always just wanted a little more time, and we got it for 60 years. It was a miracle that she lived past the teenage years and then her 20s, and there was a lot of close calls. And later in life, if it wasn't for her daughter Billy and the responsibility of being a mother, I think she maybe would have left us even sooner. I mean, there was no question that she held herself to some accountability because of her daughter. We all do.
Yeah.
Kids
Yeah.
make you be responsible.
Mm-hmm.
Well, or they don't, in which case you're a crap
Yeah,
parent.
you're right. What about your last moments with Carrie?
Well, so Carrie and I had the moment that's relevant is she was going to come home for her birthday, but she couldn't make it because they were filming Star Wars. And then she came home like a few weeks later, and we had this big birthday party. And my mother was adamant that we had to have the biggest blowout party of all time. So we literally went crazy. I mean, we had so much equipment. It was it was the wildest party we'd ever thrown, the most elaborate. We had to have generators brought in. I mean, it was like, it's like crazy, this party.
Yeah.
And so, and you know what? At first, Carrie wasn't that into it. And then when she saw everything was happening, she was like, yeah, this is fantastic. So that party went on and it went on and on and on. And then it was like the end of the party comes and everybody's leaving. And finally, Carrie and I are alone in her den. And we have this really beautiful moment where we were like, you know, it's soon, it's just going to be you and me. We need to go back to our days where we traveled together, and we need to go back to that because we're not going to have her that much longer. It's more than obvious. We almost lost her the year before. She had a stroke, and we almost lost my mom, and then she came back, and we just had to recognize that it wasn't going to be, it was a finite amount of time we were going to have our mother. And she was like reaching out like, hey, it's you and me, kid. And I was like,
Yeah.
hey, I am in, just like old times. That's why we're here. And we just had this beautiful moment and we were both in tears and it was a great moment. And a few days later, she left and went back to Europe, to England to work
Hmm.
on the film. And, she never came home. Uh,
Yeah.
I mean, she did come home, but she had had a stroke on the plane. And my last moments with her, was just one sided. It was me talking in her ear in the hospital. And I tried to encourage her to stick around, uh, and I reminded her of those words that she spoke. But there was no way, that she could do it physically. She just, too much had happened to her.
Yeah.
The damage on the plane,
Mm.
apparently, was too much. You combine that with the already pre-existing conditions that she had. She wasn't in the greatest health. I mean, my sister literally drank a 6-pack of Coke a day every day of her life.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
and she was an intermittent smoker, even though she didn't
Right.
fully admit it. And then you couple that in with the freaking pills that the doctors gave her. My God, I mean, it was
Mm.
endless amounts of different medications and psychotropic drugs, and so she took her body took a lot of abuse. Genetically, Carrie and I were almost identical. I mean, our hair color, our eye color, our physique, everything about us, skin tone, everything was very similar because we were very obviously the same parents, but also very, you know, only a year apart, etc. So genetically, we were very similar, and a lot of times we sort of felt things the same, like twins do. We had sort of these interesting little sort of connections, and
Hmm.
so I always, I never, like, I always thought, wow, I don't know how you're surviving all of this. I mean, I watched her go through overdoses and things, and I was like, this is so hard on your body, and I've never had these issues, so I don't. Nobody understands, trust me, what it's like to walk in those shoes unless you
Right.
actually walk in those shoes, which I never have.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
never judged her. And all the people that judged my sister, I used to say, you know what? You don't know. You don't have these issues. You don't know what another man's burden is. and so and then like when the press called me after she died, sometime later they snuck the toxicology report out of the hospital, against
Mhm.
everybody's wishes,
Right.
and they called me and said, well, what do you think about this report about drugs being in Carrie's system? I'm like, what? Like, who cares? Well, what do you think? I don't think anything. I mean, what? That's news? Oh, there's drugs in Carrie's system. Shocking. Oh, well, there's some news. Let's send out the world. I mean, it's like I said, did you read any of her books? She outed herself for
Right.
the last 30 years. I mean, come on.
Clearly, they didn't watch
Postcards from
wishful.
the edge.
Yeah,
Wishful
right,
thinking.
or wishful drinking.
Let's go back to postcards from the edge. It's three
Yeah.
decades ago. It's or 4 decades. It's like the that was what was brilliant about Carrie is she was willing to put herself out there. She was
Right.
willing to, as she used to say, our family wears its underwear on the outside of its clothes. And what she meant by that is there's like nothing private in this family because we are owned by our fan base. So everything is shared and you have to
Right.
just own that. And she was okay with it. And she did. She shared everything with
Yeah.
her fans. And that's partly what a lot of those books were about. And when she outed herself for mental illness, I mean, that's heroic stuff.
She was, I think, way more heroic than her Princess Leia character.
Well, they certainly are one and the same, but you're right because Princess Leia didn't have the ailments that Carrie had in real life.
Right.
So the idea that you could be Princess Leia while you have a mental illness and write 6 books and rewrite 50 scripts and act in 50 movies
Hmm.
and still be Princess Leia.
Right.
I mean, that's pretty
Yeah,
friggin' remarkable.
that is.
So
Yeah.
she's in many ways more heroic than my mother. People always, knew my mother to be pretty heroic because of the way she survived divorce and a lot of things and public humiliation and by my father. And, people always admired her for the way she handled herself in life like that. And that was an admirable thing. But Carrie was more heroic in the sense that she had to do it all while having a mental illness.
Right.
That is a remarkable accomplishment and inspirational thing for others to see. That's what's so great about it is I cannot tell you how many literally thousands of people have written me or come up to me and told me how important it is to them that they could see, oh, if she could survive this and do all of this, and if she could take the shame away from mental illness and make it okay for us to have this disorder, I can live without that burden. I mean, that's a huge thing. People are crushed by shame,
Yeah.
and she made it okay and removed the shame. That is a miracle.
Well, when you watch Wishful Drinking, which I just did again the other night, it's a one-person show that Carrie put together.
Absolutely.
And it is amazing. It is a must-watch, especially when talking about the family tree.
Yeah, it's rather splintered.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that family tree started when your parents met. Now, I've heard the story that they met on a movie set. A couple weeks later, they get married. They're America's sweetheart. But there's more to that story, right?
Yeah, well, so it's actually reading my father's book, you get one story. Reading my mother's book, you get another story. But then there's another story, which comes from my father's best friend, who's long since passed away. But I spoke to him about this. His name was Bernie Rich, and they were in the Korean War together. And my father was part of the He was an enlisted man, but he was also an entertainer in the Korean War. And he was entertaining the troops, as my mother was also. She had come from the States as part of Operation Entertainment to entertain the troops. And so she's on stage and he's standing in the wings looking out, and he's standing next to his friend. They're both privates. And he says to Bernie Rich, he says, I'm going to get that girl. And he said, what do you mean? He says, I'm going to marry that girl. And Bernie was like, yeah, right. Well, segue forward, the war has to end. So like months go by before he's back in the States and they're back together. And then the Hollywood romance begins and he turns on the charm. So the reality is that Eddie Fisher was actually stalking my mother. And so that's sort of, that's the truth. I mean, he was literally obsessed with her, and he was going to, we use the term conquest. He was going to conquer her, and he did, because he had charm like you cannot believe. Believe me, a lot of people don't understand the Eddie Fisher thing, but if you understand, look at the women that he landed and tell me he didn't have something magic. You don't land Debbie Reynolds, Elizabeth Taylor, Connie Stevens. Look at and there's others that he landed that he didn't marry. You don't land these women unless you have something going on. So he had this boy charm, that was pretty. And my mother's no fool. She's not like, she didn't just fall out of bed. Yeah, they were both naive and in their 20s, and it was young love and all of that. And so look, when that marriage fell apart too, the other thing that I like to look at is, and there's a different side. So we all know the big story where my dad leaves. My dad leaves my mother for Elizabeth Taylor after Mike Todd dies. Now, I was named after Mike Todd. He was my dad's best friend. So it's kind of natural that my mother and father would have been consoling Liz. And as Carrie likes to say, my father moved from her side gradually around to her front. And, because and that is true, exactly what happened. But if you see the pictures of Elizabeth Taylor at this time, I encourage you to see the pictures of Elizabeth Taylor at this time. I mean, she is stunning. And I'm not condoning his behavior on any level, except you can understand how mesmerizing that was. I mean, he literally was blinded by this beautiful, charming lady who had her own magic. She really did. I mean, she was an amazing, charming person in her own right. Yeah. My mother was impish and beautiful and so many wonderful things, but she was also a good girl, and Liz was far from that.
I couldn't help but noticing every time you mentioned Liz, Archie's whistling. So even Archie agrees
see what
with
I'm saying? All guys react the same way. I have a picture of Liz from this time that I have in my studio, this blown up huge. And it's a picture from right at the time that this is all going on when my dad left. And many people have stood with me and they've said, "Are you pissed off about what happened with your dad?" And I point to that picture and I say, "You see that girl right there?" And they all go, "Yes." I say, "Can you relate?" And they say, "Well, I guess so." I said, "Be honest. Let's be honest for a minute, okay? Can you understand what happened?" You know what I mean? It's like, and I look, he got his ass kicked for what he did. Okay. I mean, he lost his Coca-Cola contracts. He got booted by the recording companies. He lost everything.
Right. Well, she had some kickback too from that, right?
You got to admire one thing. I mean, like he did put it, he put it all out there. I mean, that is it's crazy. But it's admirable too. I mean, he literally threw it all out there for love, so to speak.
Right. Hey, so I've got to ask because the Star Wars geeks out there are going to force me to ask, and myself included. Were you satisfied with the way that Star Wars handled the character's death?
Well, it's obviously there's a duality to my issue there. You're watching you're watching your sister die. You're also watching the character die. Now, I have an issue with the idea or the necessity to dispose of these characters. I mean, to me, those original characters are the heart of the story. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about the droids. I'm talking about Yoda. I'm talking about Harrison and Mark and Carrie. I mean, to me, it's the heart of the whole story.
Yeah.
And so the idea that there's some necessity to dispose of it, I just don't get it.
Right.
It's like in a soap opera. They used to do this all the time. And then they would realize what a mistake it was. The fans would be upset, and they'd have to figure out some way to bring these people back from the dead. Why not? Why bother? I mean, so no, I'm not a big fan of the killing off of those characters. They will always be inseparable from the storyline. You will never be able to separate those characters, Mark and Carrie and Harrison, from that storyline. And all the new characters. You just, I mean, I'm not saying they don't have merit. I'm just saying you're never going to be able to separate those things.
Yeah, those movies did not have the magic of the first set of movies, and the second set, really. I mean, the second set was decent, but the first set was just so good.
Now to give J.J. Abrams some credit, I mean, what J.J. did with the last film with Carrie in it was outstanding, magical. And if it wasn't for him, Carrie wouldn't have been in the movie at all, hardly,
Mm.
if at all. So, but it took someone like him to champion it, someone that had his clout. I'm just a big mouth or John the Baptist crying in the wilderness, and and I am outspoken, and I don't mind. But I try to, and look, I'm Carrie's brother. I have an opinion. Is it relevant? Well, either it is or it isn't. You could take it as such. I wasn't, it's like they were pissed off at a lot of the things that I had said. Like they were annoyed with me, like I could be some impartial person to all of this.
Right.
Oh, you have to think more like a corporate person.
Yeah, right.
No, I'm just Carrie's brother, and this is the way I think.
Well, I got to tell you, so with your family, you're spanning fans throughout my family. Because so I told my son that I was going to be talking to, Carrie Fisher's, Princess Leia's brother. And he said, Luke? And I'm like, no,
Exactly.
not exactly.
No, listen, I've had people walk up to me. I've been introduced before, like a kid will walk up to me and someone will say, hey, this is Princess Leia's brother. And they'll say, oh, so you're Luke Skywalker. And I'll be like, not exactly.
Right.
And then see, I said, what I said, I am sort of related to Luke because of Carrie, but I think we might have different parents.
Right.
You'll feel I'm a brother by a different mother. Is that how that works?
Yeah, exactly. And then I told my mom, and she, so I said, oh, I'm going to talk to, and instead of saying, Carrie Fisher's brother, I said, I'm going to talk with Debbie Reynolds' son. And she's, oh, Todd? She knew right away.
Yeah, so the Debbie fans are an interesting group, because they've known her forever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's decades. Yeah. But what's cool about my mother is that she spanned 7 decades of fans. Because she did the Halloween Town stuff, there were a lot of little kids that know her as Aunt Aggie, and they would walk up to her in the airport and say, Aunt Aggie, Aunt Aggie. And the parents are like, no, that's Debbie Reynolds. They go, no, it's Aunt Aggie. And my mother was so okay with that. The idea that another generation embraced her, another generation of fans embraced her.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful thing. I mean, how many people in their career can say, I spanned 7 decades of fans. I touched 7 decades of fans.
I find it fascinating, and this is kind of an unplanned question here. So you did some Vegas performing. You're playing the guitar on stage, things like that. You did not really enjoy being in front of the camera. You like the behind the camera, and just listening to this interview today, I feel like in many ways you were kind of behind the scenes, helping out and doing things to make all of that magic that they were doing happen as well, because you were helping out Carrie with the struggles that she was going through, helping out your mom. It's kind of an interesting take on you being
well. I have a way of explaining it. I considered myself the designated driver.
That's perfect.
Because at one time or another, my mother was off the rails. Carrie goes off the rails. So I spent a lot of time trying to keep them on the rails. I tell you, I was never attracted. I did some acting in my time. I did some television and film stuff, and I'm not saying I don't like it. It's fun, but I just never saw it as something that I wanted to be my career, my job. I much preferred orchestrating other things from behind the scenes and seeing projects born, from paper to film or paper to digital. I just enjoyed the process of seeing things created from nothing. An actor also does that, but it's just not as broad. And I like the process too much. When I was a little boy, my mother had a television special called The Sound of Children. It's actually the first time Carrie appears on television and I in acting roles. And Carrie loved it. And we were working on the Disney back lot. And when I arrived on the set, all these people that I had grown up around, crew members and camera people, they were all out working. And I immediately wanted to go out and hang out with them. But as I was walking towards them, I was grabbed and moved into a trailer with all the other actors, where we were proceeded to have class and then to make sure our lines and then do makeup and hair and wardrobe. And all I could do was look out the window and see where all the magic was happening.
Right.
The wranglers were out there with the horses and the wagons and the camera guys with the lights and all of the props and all this. And I'm looking out at that window and I'm sitting, I'm like, what am I doing in here?
Right.
And I had an epiphany. I was a Cub Scout, by the way. I was playing a Cub Scout, but I was actually a Cub Scout. So pre-Boy Scout, 10 years old, and it was like an epiphany, like, wow, this is just not where I want to be. I'm not saying other people don't enjoy that, hanging out in the dressing room, waiting to go out there, and everybody else does all the technical stuff. But I thought, no, man, the magic is out there. That's the magic I want to be involved in.
Hey, so I'll mention your books one more time, or your book one more time. My Girls: A Lifetime with Carrie and Debbie. Also, the Bright Lights, starring Carrie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds.
Yeah, that's on HBO on demand. Yeah.
Todd, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. It's been great chatting with you. You're very tuned into the subject matter. I guess everybody was shocked that you weren't prepared. That you said this. You had one question that wasn't pre-prepared.
Yeah, I like to, I like to prep.
No, you had it down. You truly. Well, I could tell you're also a big Star Wars fan. So that's something we all have in common.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you, Todd, so much for joining me. And thank you for listening and subscribing to Learning More. We'd love it if you could tell your friends about the show and share it on your social media. We've got some great shows coming up that you're definitely going to want to hang in there for. Yeah, the Olympic ruins. We're going to be talking about that. The modern Olympic ruins. It seems like nobody wants to host the games anymore. We're going to learn more about that. We're also going to be learning more about narcissism. We're going to learn more about ghosts. We got all kinds of cool shows coming up. So be sure to subscribe. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.